Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be having a bit of an advanced Victoria 3 tutorial, so if you're a beginner, this will not be the tutorial for you, but what we are going to be looking at is we are going to be looking at this figure here, which is the reinvestment multiplier, and some downstream effects that are a result of this. We are going to use some spreadsheets, so if you have children, I ask that you hide them, ask them to leave, put them in the cupboard, etc., mostly etc., but what this modifier is it multiplies all sources of reinvestment that go into the investment pool by this multiplier here, regardless of where they're coming from, whether it's government reinvestment, capitalist investment, aristocrat investments, it doesn't matter. It's multiplied by this. This is a modifier that is applied in the range of 0 GDP to 50 million GDP. At 0 GDP, you will have a 3x multiplier, and at 50 million GDP, you will have a 1x multiplier and 1x multiplier at every GDP thereafter. What this does is it creates an interesting effect where you are having an increasing level of GDP, right, and then a decreasing level of multiplier, and this creates a sort of gummed up zone around 37 million GDP, although you start slowing down at 25 million GDP, where you will have decreasing returns as a result of the way the math works on your investment pool. Now, this alongside, the entirety of this multiplier thing is going to have several effects, but the short TLDR is, for the people who don't want to watch this entire video or an extensive kind of explanation of the ideas, is going to be there are three main takeaways. The first is that laissez-faire, in addition to just being the best economic system law, is way better when you're under 50 million GDP. It's just disgustingly better. Second of all, gaining unilateral investment rights into someone when you are under around maybe 45 million GDP is going to be good on the short term. I don't know exactly how well to evaluate it, because a short-term trade-off to maybe having a bad term, long-term kind of effect, it's kind of hard to evaluate, but in the short term, having getting foreign investment can be good because it doesn't increase your GDP when you buy a building, and keeping your GDP low allows you to keep a bigger multiplier when it comes to this reinvestment. And finally, knowing that your GDP or your return on your GDP is going to slow down when you hit this wall of 37 million-ish GDP, knowing this kind of affects play patterns in the sense that you do not view your GDP growth in the same way, and so you want to be slightly more hesitant about spending, although that's just a very general and broad rule, because you know that your returns on your spending aren't going to be as great when you're kind of in this gummed up zone where you are having diminishing returns on your GDP growth as it relates to getting reinvestment, which is an important source of income for you in Victoria 3. Without further ado, hide your children, because we're going to have a spreadsheet. So here we have it, the spreadsheet that we are going to be using for evaluating this. I hope you hid all your children under the age of 38, but importantly, I just want to guide your attention to here, because this is how we're going to describe and take a look at this phenomenon here, is using this, and everything flows on the right will flow out from an understanding of this system. So here we have the GDP, which, as you may be able to infer, is going to give the GDP of the individual nation, whatever that nation is, and we will also have important breakpoints here that we will come in and explain a little bit later as time goes through, but I just wanted to highlight these for everyone. We will have the percent modifier that is currently being applied to reinvestment. And so this number will go down in a linear fashion all the way to 50, at which point it will stall out. There will be no more decreases, and you will just always multiply by 50. Whenever we're kind of evaluating stuff, we're going to relativize it to what it looks like at post 50, because this is most of the game. And so when we're looking at this amount of investment pool, what we are looking at is this is the amount of investment pool you would be getting per GDP, or sorry, this is the amount of investment pool you would be getting, or what GDP it would be worth if you were above the 50 mark. So when we are at 1 GDP, or 1 million GDP, we are getting 2.96 million GDP worth of reinvestment with all the buildings that we have. And so this is the investment pool contribution here, and it is achieved by multiplying the GDP times, the modifier here. And so, in this sense, if we had 140 million GDP, we would be getting, 10%. At 5 million GDP, we get 10% of what we would be getting if we had 140 million GDP instead. Because 140 million GDP has a much smaller modifier. It has a modifier of 1, and we have a modifier of 2.8, for example. Now, if we scroll all the way down, we will see here's where the wall starts, at 37 and 38 million GDP. Why don't we highlight this one as well? Because this is the start of the wall. And this is the point at which your return on an increasing GDP actually goes negative, because the multiplier is now so large that just increasing the GDP by, and the number you're multiplying by the multiplier, is already so large that increasing the GDP by 1, this only increases the GDP by what, like 2.5%, close to 2.5%, the relative increase from 38 to 39. This is less valuable than just having a multiplier of 1.48 versus 1.44. So you will see the amount of GDP effective, or that you are getting worth of investment pool, will actually go down from 56 million to 400 to 56 million 0.16. And we have here this column here, which is marginal IP, which is achieved by, subtracting the amount of IP we are getting on each level of GDP, subtracting the previous GDP from the next level of GDP. And so this was the marginal amount that has changed when we jumped up to this new GDP, and you will see this will go down and down and down, and then here it becomes negative. And it becomes just slightly negative, right? We are barely losing out at 39 million. We're barely losing out at 40 million, but then this gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until like the actual 49 and 48, like this zone of 48 to 50, you actually probably decrease your budget in a lot of contexts. Not every context, because there's a lot of sources of income other than investment pool when you increase your GDP, which is a very, very strange spot to be in. But after that, every GDP you increase, when you already are at the 1 multiplier, will effectively give you 1 more GDP worth of GDP. And so you will need to go up to 57 million GDP in order to fully recover back to a level above this 38 million GDP line where the GDP started increasing. So you will have to go all the way up to 57 million, and so we are going to think of that as the end of the wall here. All right, for our next section, we are calculating the nominal amount that is contributed to the investment pool, or in the case of interventionism, investment pool or government dividends. And for this, the most important takeaway is going to be that there is a distinction between how much each of these groups are contributing. If we just jump back into game real quick, we will be able to take a look at the economic system laws, right? And we will see laissez-faire will have 100% government dividends reinvestment. So that means when something is owned by the government, 100% of it will go into reinvestment. That means 100% of the balance of any building, right? So if we take a look at Pennsylvania here, 100% of this balance will go to reinvestment. That means 100% of that balance is getting multiplied by this disgusting 2.36x modifier. So this is absolutely huge on laissez-faire, and it's disgusting, but it's only when the government owns it. Once it is owned by a capitalist, then we will be relying on the capitalist investment pool contribution. Now we are, for the sake of simplicity, only using capitalist ownership contribution. Shopkeepers have a lower contribution rate, but capitalists will have a 30% contribution rate, so 30% will reach the investment pool via the investment pool mechanic. Important to note, you will still extract more money from the capitalists in various other ways, whether it be, dividends, taxes, consumption taxes, per capita taxation, all various means by which you have to extract wealth from the capitalists, but they will only be giving 30% to the investment pool, kind of in here, under normal circumstances with which to be modified by this number. However, if they are giving a juiced up number to this investment pool, like say if you are on laissez-faire and you are getting this dividends investment pool contribution efficiency, that juiced up number will be multiplicatively effective with this modifier here. So that means if you somehow got capitalist, their normal contribution is 30%, and you somehow got plus 50% capitalist investment pool efficiency, you would be getting this 30% It gets juiced up, free money, to 45%, and then it would be multiplied. This 45% would be multiplied by this number here. And so the free money modifiers will be multiplicatively effective with this modifier here. This is important to note, but the base contribution of 30% is way lower than the reinvestment of government dividends that you see on laissez-faire. Interventionism is kind of splitting the difference in some regard, because you will have 50% government dividends reinvestment, so a larger chunk of money is going to this reinvestment, but also under interventionism, there's the important thing to note, which that there is going to be a government dividends efficiency. Whenever something is a government dividends, which half of their allocation will be allocated to government dividends instead, what will end up happening is half of that will get deleted. If we take a hover over government dividends, we will see our government dividends efficiency is 50%. So for interventionism, half the money goes to the investment pool, right, and is juiced through this when we have a government-owned building. The other half will go towards government dividends reinvestment, and then it will be multiplied by this modifier, and a portion of it will be deleted. But it is the case very, very early on in low GDP that even despite this money deletion, interventionism and owning stuff by the government will be a little bit better. So with kind of that explanation said, we can take a look at some of these things here, as well as some of the assumptions we're making. But the first thing that might be very, very striking is nominally, or perhaps unsurprising, laissez-faire is just giving a disgustingly huge amount. It is important to note that all of the private ownership looks really bad because it completely excludes any means of taxation that you will have for the capitalists and other means of extracting money from them, whether it is consumption taxes or other sorts of things, by which you can definitely extract more money. If we just jump back into the game real quick, we could show off like what it would look like if we just added in a few consumption taxes. Let's say we go after services, tobacco, because that's relatively high, luxury, furniture, and transportation, something like this, which looks relatively standard. We raise it up to slightly high taxes. We will be able to see just how much taxes that are getting achieved on our upper strata here. So we could tax 15% out, and this is on a system that's not particularly good for extracting wealth from them. So you would expect to see more kind of income generated in this way than is shown on this chart. Another thing is we are assuming 100% capitalist ownership. Again, this is unlikely to happen, but interventionism private is kind of maybe a little bit more of a compromise, because you will often have happy industrialists or go laissez-faire of what will happen if you had a more normal looking economy. But obviously some of your stuff will be owned by aristocrats. They have a smaller contribution rate of 20%, and so you can think of this number as perhaps being a little bit smaller, or some of these other numbers as being a little bit smaller if you wanted a more realistic economy. But for the sake of simplicity, because you can have varying looking economies, we have just used 100% capitalist. For this, we are multiplying these numbers by 0.95 to account for an effect where that is difficult to account for, where throughput is going to be negatively applied to buildings that are owned by the government. So even though the reinvestment is better because we're being juiced through the modifier in a much stronger way, we have to account for the fact that we're going to lose throughput. And you end up losing the value of lost throughput by government-owned buildings is in excess of what the number of actual lost throughput because of how stuff works. So if we find something that is government owned, which might be a little bit difficult for us. So if we find something that's government owned, this doesn't have enough levels for it to matter, but if we will have minus 50% from our economies scale bonus. So what will end up happening is if we have a building that's profitable, this weekly balance, this is the number that will go down when there is less profit. The wages won't go down by 50% if you add this minus 50% penalty. Instead, the amount that's getting made, this $4,900 in total, it would all eat into the weekly balance here. And so the weekly balance gets cut first. And so if you have negative throughput, it negatively applies to balance, which is the thing that's going into dividends, whether it's owned by the capitalists or it's owned by the government. This is the part that feeds into dividends. And so as a result of this, even if we have a 5% penalty, to throughput, because we have an average of level 10 buildings, more than that 5% will get applied. But for the sake of kind of just looking at these modifiers here, just to kind of be clear with the way we're doing it, this modifier is probably overestimating money deletion effects by negative throughput in this early band of, kind of GDP, and it is probably overestimating it in this later band of GDP, underestimating it in this later band of GDP, but this is an important assumption we have made, and also interventionism, the value in here includes the amount that is going to government dividends. So with this, we kind of have the nominal amount that we are receiving into, kind of our coffers, as it were. Notably, we do get a lot of control with interventionism, and this is an important checkbox that's positive for interventionism. If you can't drain the investment pool, if you cannot drain the investment pool whatsoever, extra money into the investment pool is less useful at that point in time, and interventionism tends to give you more money directly into your pockets as a result of the government dividends than something like laissez-faire, although it's the numbers are such that interventionism's not going to look that well in either case. All right, just tweak the calculation a little bit here under interventionism. It wasn't quite right. It was actually over-reporting the amount of GDP worth of income from investment pool and government dividends that interventionism was receiving, and so we just updated that. But this brings us to kind of the most important section here, which is how much free money is being generated, or how much GDP worth of free money in the investment pool is being generated as a result of the combination of the economic system you're on, and also what it is that you are doing, whether the buildings are privately owned or publicly owned. And as you can see here, unambiguously, the most powerful in the early game is laissez-faire. We have the heat map here, and it just absolutely crushes, others in terms of free money. When you're on 18 GDP, you're effectively have 40 million GDP worth of investment pool income, because this is the free income on top of what you would be normally receiving. So that's double, you're effectively operating at double the GDP when stuff is government owned under laissez-faire, because there's 100% government dividends reinvestment, and then that's being multiplied by up to 3 if you're, at 0 GDP. What we see eventually is that this becomes less and less and less and less, and it eventually becomes negative. Eventually, you will have a money deletion effect that is the result of the negative throughput. This is why it was important for us to put this in here, because eventually it becomes no longer the case that you should just have this monstrous amount. So you can see here off to the side, we have at 49 million GDP, laissez-faire is starting to delete money with the considerations we've made towards how big that throughput modifier should be. But if you had just a single state economy and you had 49 billion GDP, you would likely experience money deletion considerably earlier, because the throughput modifier would be more negative. And so this is kind of the important one. And so, but here's the problem. With laissez-faire, you can't control whether or not you sell buildings to the government, or you sell them to private investors, or you hold onto them to the government. And to the extent that you can influence this type of thing, it is a little bit marginal. You can try and make sure you do not idle the queue and instead engage in government construction to maximize government-owned buildings under laissez-faire. You can try and get investment rights with other countries to try and drain your own investment pool on their buildings, so that you can produce buildings and not have your investment pool buy those buildings for the duration of this period, where they will be contributing insane amounts to the GDP, or insane amounts of GDP worth of income, kind of per GDP worth of building. And so this is kind of some stuff you can do, but for the most part, you don't have much agency. Where you have agency is with interventionism. However, interventionism doesn't really do that well, because first of all, it's sending half as much money through the modifier as laissez-faire is, because the amount that goes to government dividends does not get spit through the reinvestment free money modifier. So only half, the 50% of the money is spent through this. On top of that, when you're talking about money deletion effects, that is money that's being removed from the economy, the government dividends reinvestment, which we are assuming is 50%. You can get a little bit higher, through technology, but by the time you have that technology, you should be over 50 million GDP anyways, so we've excluded that here. We see that interventionism at no point outperforms laissez-faire because it is deleting 25% of the dividend worth of money. However, it's not underperforming, laissez-faire with no modifiers by that much, right? And so you having government ownership is not that bad under interventionism, and so this is maybe like it's not great, but it's not bad. It's really close, as opposed to after 50 million GDP, government ownership really starts hemorrhaging some money because this money deletion effect is going to trend considerably downward and kind of have its equilibrium where it's going to be deleting a quarter. That is, here you can see it's deleted 17, is going to be deleting a quarter of the amount plus whatever throughput penalty you're applying. So it's going to delete 15 plus a number that is going to be relative to how much we are accounting for a throughput penalty. So we see here in particular, if you are on interventionism, it is at 9 million GDP-ish. We updated this. We had it at 8 before, but when we updated the calculation a little bit, it did change to 9. And 9 million GDP is when we have interventionism with private ownership beating out interventionism with government ownership in terms of free money created. However, the amount of money in your hand, in your pocket, is probably a little bit better with government ownership, especially if you have a tax system that is relatively regressive, and it may be up to like 12 or 13 or 14, maybe even 17 million, like this type of range of GDP, it might be still better to own government buildings. Something like this, just depending on your tax system and your ability to extract money and your just ability to build more construction. But the point at which, in terms of money deletion, the threshold that we have with our calculation is around 9 million GDP. You will be better off having the buildings privately owned versus government owned. And so interventionism doesn't quite look that good. Which sort of brings us to private ownership, which generally speaking does not experiencing anywhere near as robust an effect as a result of this multiplier that we have for being under 50 million GDP, because obviously it's sending less money there, and it would be sending even less if we assumed that it was not 100% capitalist, which it wouldn't be. And to be fair, this is maybe also an argument for these breakpoints being slightly different and being slightly higher on kind of in favor of laissez-faire and interventionism, although interventionism, even if it had that help, it's really not performing that well. But in particular, kind of wanted to point out some breakpoints. At 16-ish million GDP, happy laissez-faire will be twice as good as government, as intervention ownership, which is a very, very considerable up in terms of the free money. And a big part of this is, again, that it's really not that big a margin of difference between 30% and 50%, and interventionism is deleting money. Another kind of important breakpoint is going to be around, I think it's 27 million is where we have the absolute peak, 28 million, where we have the absolute peak for free money being created here before we start to fall off as well as a result. Even on the private ownership, we start to fall off as a result of some of the systems. I guess it's peak here is at 27 if we're on interventionism, and it's 28 million here. But we start to see this slowing down, this slumping effect, as we also see the marginal investment pool dips below 1, as per hitting the wall here. It's around this point. We have interventionism deleting value. I think we talked about it. Oh, looks like we need to move that modifier down 1, that little cell down to 35 here. But another important breakpoint we wanted to talk about is at around 40 million GDP is where laissez-faire happy is going to beat laissez-faire gov, except we actually have to move this down 2 cells. We did a little bit of changes in our assumptions. We were assuming slightly more money deletion, which I think might be a little bit more accurate, but we're going to move this one down. All right, so we fixed this breakpoint. The reason we changed from a 0.07 to assumption to a 0.5 assumption in terms of 0.05 assumption in terms of the money deletions was because we're assuming capitalist ownership or 100% capitalist ownership. But we've already discussed that. So what is it that our strategy should be, and how should we think about it? So first of all, most straightforward is government ownership under laissez-faire is insanely good. Unfortunately, you can't choose not to sell your buildings under laissez-faire, otherwise you would, but anything that allows you to get more government buildings is ideal. You don't have much agency in this regard, but this does make going laissez-faire much more appealing because you are going to frictionally have a certain percentage of your buildings be government owned, and when you take that into account, you will absolutely crush interventionism. Even if you have like 10% laissez-faire government owned and 90% laissez-faire private owned, you will just absolutely crush interventionism because laissez-faire is already outperforming interventionism anyways. And so this isn't a very important thing to note. But another thing that's going to come up, kind of in this entire evaluation that is really difficult to quantify is, generally speaking, your investment pool will probably grow faster than you can spend it. And this creates problems for you as the player. Now, if you're taking in other sources of income and you can pay for more construction in order to try and drain your investment pool, this is ideal. But very often the government wages, you just can't keep up with the amount of free money you're getting. And so you kind of can't really fully utilize the amount of money you're getting. And if you can't fully utilize the free money modifier or the investment pool, then it's effectively not free money anymore. And it's just a delayed kind of onset of money that you'll eventually be able to tap into. I really don't know how to quantify this in a way that was very satisfactory, but to the extent that you are having a bunch of money creation and a bunch of free money, as a player, you have to try as hard as possible when you are in that range where you are just super, super juiced up, which is basically up to around the breakpoint where you start slowing down, around 30 million GDP. You have to try and find other sources of income in order so you can pay for all the government wages so that you can build enough construction to properly make use of the investment pool, which is a tough thing to do. There's a bunch of different sources of income. Stuff like getting war reparations on Qing, for example, allows you to help pay for that government wages, which can cover, also very important, is running low government wages, especially this time period. To some extent, higher taxes if you can get away without causing too much radicalism, but maybe you just go for broke. You cause the radicalism with the idea that you're going to slow down or you're going to intentionally rev something to this effect, but being able, well, here we're not even legitimate, but being able to properly make use of this enormous investment pool is going to be a practical issue that is kind of beyond the scope of trying to address in this video. We also talked about, kind of briefly, but want to come back to it, getting investment rights, specifically unilateral investment rights. We don't want people increasing our GDP. We want to gain the benefit of building stuff that is utilizing our investment pool in other people's countries, especially when we're at this lower GDP. And so whenever we have a building that's overseas, so for example, whenever our country builds a building, that over here in Liberia, which I don't know if Liberia starts with any buildings that are owned by us, it doesn't look like it, but whenever the USA builds a building over here, it doesn't increase our GDP. It increases Liberia's GDP. So there's a theoretical run where you try and depress your own GDP, keep it as low as possible, and have a bunch of investment rights and invest in a bunch of people. But in theory, if you're gaining investment rights and you're using this to drain more of your investment pool, and then you are stalling yourself out, at kind of maybe one of these thresholds where you are having the absolute most government, well, actually just as low as possible is best. But if you have investment rights in here, and then you are getting the multiplier, and you're getting this huge, kind of multiplier juice, and then you're finding a way to stick at a low GDP because you're getting reinvestment, this can be really valuable. So getting investment rights in the early game, to the extent that you can get it, is going to be something that is preferable, but also generating subjects gives you kind of a similar thing because you always have investment rights in your subjects. So subjugating people in the early game is going to be slightly preferable because it will cause you to increase your own GDP less because you will have an outlet for that subject, and instead you will be able to generate more investment pool. Now the problem is you're generating investment pool rather than buildings. But this is also going to be a reason reason why the UK, for example, is even stronger than they look, because the UK has a ton of really good investment opportunities in India, and they get a super juiced amount of investment pool. That is coming in. Here, let's swap to Great Britain. They get a super juiced amount of investment pool. What were we on, like 24 or 34 on the USA? Because they have a bunch of buildings that is owned by, look at this reinvestment. It's 4x the USA's. That is absolutely insane. And we are getting just a huge amount from India. And then our GDP isn't that high. It's not, 4x the USA's GDP. It's a little bit higher, yes, but we are going to have this. And then, in turn, we're going to buy up a bunch of the EIC's buildings and be able to keep our GDP low because we're increasing the EIC's GDP, which the EIC, incidentally, I believe is over this 50 million point, so they're not going to even be able to make, or no, they're not. The old EIC was, the truth hurts, shout out to nerfing the sub-farms, but they're not going to be able to make use of this modifier as very well. In fact, they're already in the wall, right, where extra GDP is not going to help them with their reinvestment. Although, to be fair, I think they start out with extraction economies, so they already have sussy, contribution and this type of thing. And the final thing is, when you are approaching this 37 million mark, I think that, you value growing your GDP less. And everything that cascades down from that is going to be like an effect that you consider. So if you are wanting to maybe rake back spending in order to avoid being in a credit, like a credit spot, like if you are an unrecognized power, this is often something you want to do. Or let's say you're at like a 75% credit and you want to rake back, this type of thing. This would be a good time to do it, because kind of coming back into looking at the spreadsheet, the 37 million is where you really start to experience quite a bit of pain in terms of it's not very marginally valuable to run through, the subsequent 12 million GDP. It's not as marginally valuable as it would be in a normal situation without this modifier being applied. And so if you stall out at 37, it's much better to stall out at 37, or even a number before 37, like 26 even, or like anything in this range is much better to stall out at than it is to stall out down here. And also, it's possible when you get to like 50 million that you want to just start spending very aggressively. Although, like, now you're just in normal zone. Once you're at 50 million, now it's just normal. Every marginal GDP is going to be exactly the same in terms of how much investment pool you get at 50 million. But it is specifically this range of 39 to 50 million that's very uncomfortable. And so I don't have an enormous amount of prescriptions as to things you do differently, other than you value the growth in your GDP considerably less when you're in this range. And so, again, spending is an example of something where you can make an adjustment. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. This was, kind of a little bit more of a technical tutorial about a kind of weird concept, a weird play pattern. Like, I don't think I like this wall. Sam, I don't think I would like it with a ham, but that's what it is. But anyways, if you did like this, though, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, YouTube algorithm thing, etc. Mostly etc. You can bring the kids out of the cabinet now. They can be safe in one moment.